I'm going to welcome her in. She is our senior certification developer. She's going to walk you through today's topic, estimation and reporting in Jira Scrum Projects. Hi, Joanna. Good morning.
Good morning, Ben. Thanks for that. Those are interesting answers. I'm excited myself for Vegas, but not the slot machines. So, okay, excellent. Let me get started then. As Ben said, this is a portion of the Managing Agile Boards and Reports Skill Builder, so please check that out if you want more information, particularly since we're diving in straight into Scrum boards this time around. So if you want a little bit of background about boards and how they fit into the whole Jira landscape, and also about Kanban boards more in particular, then make sure you go check out that free course. Now Ben's going to bring up this poll, if he can, so we can ask you about how many boards you've configured in Jira, and when you do configure, are they mostly Scrum, Kanban, or both? Good, we have a great audience. Yeah, we have a large audience today, and I see that the results are coming in, and Scrum is in the lead. So I think we're good to know that. Fantastic. It's good that it looks like a few of you have configured a few boards and some none. So we won't get too much about configuring the rest of the options, as you'll see. We'll be mostly talking about the estimation portion. So let's get right into that. So there's two ways to create boards. Automatically, when a board is created from a project, from a template using the Kanban or Scrum template. And a second way is manually. So you can create a secondary board for any of your company managed projects, or tertiary board, if you need one, that has specific sub or filter configurations that show you what you're interested in from the project or from multiple projects. So either one that's been created, whether it was created automatically or manually, you have these certain configurations. These are all the things that you can configure, and all of them except for estimation apply to both types of boards. So it's great because different Agile teams have different members and processes and personal preferences. So in total, there are these 9 board configuration areas that can be configured, except for the estimation port, which again is the focus of this webinar. So as far as the estimation statistics, there's 2 bits that can be configured. Estimation is, again, available in Scrum boards. It's part of planning for sprints. Issues can be estimated when they're in the backlog so that you can get an idea of how much work or effort an issue will take, and therefore how much total work is being committed in a sprint. And estimation is activity that's very central to Scrum development and helps to inform your team's velocity. So there's 2 options in a Scrum board. This first one is estimation statistic. It represents your velocity, how it's measured from sprint to sprint against these estimates. And so you can choose story points, the original time estimate if you prefer time, or just issue count, which means estimation is based on the number of issues that you commit to each sprint. And then the estimate field is not editable in that case because it's just the count of issues. And then finally, you can actually use any numeric custom field in Jira to use as estimation. And those estimates are entered on issues in the backlog, in the issue detail view, or in the issue detail view. So what do you think? Put this in chat. We're going to be using chat for a bit, not polls. Put in the chat what you think is the default estimation statistic in Jira. So go ahead, just let it. Yes, I could see. Good. Yep, you guys are getting it. Fantastic. The majority of you chose story points, and that's definitely correct. So okay, you can. You're still typing there. Yep, that's true. This is the default statistic. It's the default because it's the most common statistic for Agile teams, Agile Scrum teams. And these story points represent a relative measure of the amount of work that's required to complete an issue. And generally, it's provided in a Fibonacci-like format, which the Fibonacci series is 0, 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, and so on. You can impress your friends if you remember the first 20 points in a row. And so, for example, an issue can be assigned 2 story points, and that's how much is assumed to involve twice as much effort as an issue that's assigned 1 story point. So it's a measure of relative complexity and effort to other issues. So story points help the team decide how many issues can be completed based on their effort and estimated accuracy. And they're generally used to reduce anxiety and help with accuracy, because sprint estimation becomes more and more reliable with practice. And you can use actual hours, but it's not reasonable to assume that all your hours are going to be productive, because there's meetings and meetings and more meetings, and dates don't account for other non-project related work that inevitably always creeps into our days, and emails and meetings and so on. So dates also have an emotional attachment, and so relative estimation using story point removes all of that, and developers can get just a general sense of how much they can accomplish during a 2-week sprint, regardless of all of those other things. And so, as a best practice, don't assign time values to story points, because that just negates or the main reason to using story points in the first place. Okay, so now next chat. So again, use chat. Which issue types in a project is the story points field available by default? So let's see what you think about that one. And these are different combinations of issue types. I'm going to see your answer scroll and see if you're onto it. Oh, I see pretty much everybody's picking everything. In your Jira, it may indeed be on all issue types, so you could stop now. But by default, it's on the story and epic only. So if you were to have a brand new Jira cloud instance you just signed up for, creating your first Scrum project, it would be on the story and the epic by default. Now, that doesn't mean you can't put it in the other issue types. You can. So what would you need to check? So for any of you who are Jira administrators or project administrators, you might know this. So give me some guesses here in chat. Again, you don't have to, if you don't know, that's fine. We're about to tell you. And you won't be able to actually do this ad unless you are Jira administrator. But let's see if anybody knows what configurations you would check. Custom field, somebody says screens. Yep, field. All right, it's coming now, field configuration. Close, so yes, screens for sure. It has to be on a screen for you to enter the value. Issue layout in the cloud, another place, because it could be in the hidden fields area, and custom field context, somebody mentioned that. So again, some of this is more advanced because you might not be a project admin or a Jira admin, but that's okay. This is just kind of information that you could take back to the team if you needed it on a different issue type. So here's just a screenshot of where you put it on the custom field context. So now the goal is successful estimation, and that way you have a more reliable velocity, and velocity is that number of estimation units, which we just said is the amount of work generally in story points that the team can complete within a sprint. So any metric type will work, but story points are common, and in order for it to be reliable and to be reflected accurately in reports, issues should be estimated when they're in the backlog before the sprint is started, because that becomes the sprint commitment and everything burns down from there. So a team should complete their sprints on time, because reports, especially velocity charts, rely on completing those sprints within the same time box duration. Commonly, that's 2 weeks. But if your sprints weren't in the same duration, then obviously you would complete less or more depending on how much extra time is in there. Now, generally, the team should avoid scope changes, either adding issues to an active sprint or removing them, because they impact the report quality. And we'll see that a bit later in the reports. And then finally, all statuses should be mapped to columns. Otherwise, unmapped statuses will not be shown in the reports. And hopefully estimation improves over time. So, oh, sorry about that. I just realized I wasn't advancing the bullets. But anyway, so here you see on the right-hand side in the screenshot, the story points are shown there as in my case, pinned field on issue layout. So Estimation does hopefully improve over time, especially when everyone on the team is involved in that estimation. So developers, designers, testers, deployers, all of these people have a say. And so they bring a different perspective to the product and the work that's required to deliver a story. And so oftentimes teams use different techniques such as planning poker to do estimation. And here is we can look at this image to see how it appears in Jira, how estimation appears. So first of all, you can see this is an active sprint just by the fact you've got the duration listed. You see that here story points, story point value 2 is assigned to that Uni 1 ticket, and you could see it both in the view of issues in the sprint and also on the right-hand side in the issue detail view. You could see that this third one is unestimated because it doesn't have a value. And if you estimate it later, it's going to be considered scope change because the sprint's already started. And then this one's a bug and it didn't have an estimate. You could add again story points, but generally you wouldn't add them to bugs. So in summary, you just learned about the estimation statistic, and you can customize that again to be story points, time, issue count, etc. But there's also time tracking that you can configure for your project. And this is either set to none or remaining estimate and time spent. And this is what we're going to dive into right now. So the unit of time, by the way, when you use time tracking is by default in minutes. So if you were to enter a value like 5, you say 5 units is what I estimate, or 5 is what I logged. Then by default in Jira, it's minutes, but the Jira administrator can actually change that in global settings to be either default of days or hours or weeks. So if you enter, I estimate 5, that could be days by default. So again, you should be aware, but of course, Jira shows you the format when it actually displays those time settings. So there's the 2 choices in time tracking. If you don't do it, then none is the option. So if you leave not time tracking as none, which is the default way that boards are set up, then issues just burn down their estimation statistic value, the story points, when they're completed. So this is an important thing to think about. When you commit, let's say 12 story points to just for ease to a sprint, and after 3 days you've completed the first that story. After 3 days, then the story points of that first story, let's say it was 2, burn down from the 12 after those 2 days. Alternatively, if you if you set it to remaining estimate and time spent, that second toggle, then the values will burn down when users log work and update the time spent or update the time remaining fields. And so Jira is using its native fields, which are original estimate, remaining estimate, and time spent. Those are 3 fields that Jira uses for doing time tracking. So there are these two approaches, not tracking time or time tracking, are fundamentally different. So why would you do this? Well, some Scrum teams separate estimation from tracking, and they use these different units for each. Estimates are used for measuring the size of the backlog and calculating that velocity. How much can we do? And tracking is often the burn down of hours that are used during the sprint. So this helps make sure that teams are on track to complete the stories during the sprint period. So as you can see in the screenshot on the right, the story points is on top, and then you see an original estimate that's been given to the story, and that's 2D, which is 2 days. And then the time tracking, 1 day and 3 hours has already been logged. And so there's 5 hours remaining. And the next time that you log work, you could log some time and actually adjust the estimate, right? For remaining time, you could decrease it or increase it, and that is considered scope change. So let's take a look now at reports and how these various estimation statistics and time tracking settings show up on reports. Agile reports help monitor the progress of sprints and epics and releases. They control your burn down rate, and they identify any problems and bottlenecks, and they help you to continuously improve your velocity and your cycle time mostly, and cycle time is generally something you do in Kanban boards, but for sure your velocity in Scrum boards. So an overview of reports. They're very, reports are key to being agile. And like with, just like boards, agile reports help you visualize the work that the team is doing. They help you assess the progress of the current work, so the commitment that the team made versus the actuals they're delivering, and also respond if needed, if something is a blocker or an impediment during the sprint, so we can continue the work. They help you review what's been done in the past, so you can continuously improve in the future. They promote transparency, so it allows anyone with access to the project to see and have a common understanding of the current state. The transparency means there should be no surprises about the delivery of the project on time. And they help you with troubleshooting, so you can certain reports can show you, bottlenecks or why something is has been delayed, because maybe there's scope changes for other things that have been added. And they help you with planning and estimation for the future, so you can see the historic progress of the team and provide more accurate planning and estimating for upcoming sprints. Agile reports are specific to the board from which you're viewing it. That means that they'll only include the data about the issues that match the board filter. Now, if you know this about the other part of the board, there's the board filter is generally based on the whole entire project. And it is by default, if you create a project from a template and start using it, then by default, the board in a company managed project shows you all the issues from that one project. However, that board filter can be changed so that it's only showing you a subset of issues or issues from multiple projects. So a board filter doesn't always have to include just one project or even all the issues in a project. So that's an important thing to remember, because then the Agile reports will reflect that. Also, the concepts of what's to do and what's done depend on how the columns and the statuses are mapped to those columns. So especially that's true of the definition of done, which is that last column on the board. And Scrum reports, again, rely on a consistent use of the same estimation statistic, which is usually story points, to be valuable. So there are 10, in Scrum boards there are 10 reports, and they're all shown on a single page when you get to when you click on the reports link on the left-hand side of your project sidebar, and you click all reports, then you'll see all 10 of them. But we'll group them together here for the sake of the type of information that they show. So Burndown type of reports show the present state, which is the Burndown chart, Burnup chart, epic Burndown, and release Burndown. And then there are status types of reports, which show you the past, and that includes the sprint report, epic report, and version report. And finally, continuous improvement, which helps to improve the future, and that includes the velocity chart, cumulative flow diagram, and control chart. And these two are generally associated, they're the only two available in Kanban boards, and they're most useful in a Kanban board context. So we'll really only discuss those first 8 Scrum-only reports now. So a Burndown chart shows the progress of that the team is making during a sprint and tracks the total work remaining in the sprint. The sprint backlog starts with a certain number of issues, each with that associated number of story points, if that's what you're using, or another estimation statistic. Then the chart shows the actual that's being completed versus the estimate amount of work to be done in the sprint. And hence, the report projects the likelihood of achieving the sprint goal, and it helps the team manage its progress and respond accordingly. So as an example of a Burndown chart, here's a screenshot, and the horizontal axis shows you the time. So in this case, from March 14th to March 25th. The vertical axis is your estimation statistic. It starts at the top with the total amount of effort that's been estimated to complete in the sprint. So it's the total of the estimation statistics of the individual issues. In this case, story points, because you see that written on the y-axis, but it could be whatever other statistics. So let's say you were using a custom field called t-shirt size or something, you would see that. Then you see the gray columns. Those are non-working days. So you can add additional non-working days like company holidays and so on. And so that you don't expect burn down to happen in those timeframes. Then the guideline, which is the gray line, shows you the average burn down that should occur in order to finish all the work items in the sprint timeframe. And if that gray guideline does not show, it's possible that the sprint may have been started before any issues were assigned to it. So if you don't do all your estimation before the sprint is started, the guideline won't look like this, right? It'll be flat at the bottom. And then the red line is the actual burn down. So the mapping of statuses to the done column on your board determines when an issue is considered completed, right? What's the final column? And when you click on any particular point or data point, you can see more detail about the issue that burned down. So there's also a bottom to this chart, and this bottom contains a detail of all of those various data points, and it shows it in chronological order. So it shows you the date that some event happened, what was the issue that you can click on and drill in more, what was the event. So for example, was it a burn down or was it a scope change? More detail about that. So an issue is completed or added to sprint and so on. And then the increase value or the decrease value, like so increase means, a story with a certain number of story points was added to the sprint. That would be an increase. And if there was a burn down, that would be a decrease, and hence a running total of the remaining story points for that sprint. The Burnup chart is next. Excuse me, take a quick thing of coffee here. The Burnup chart provides you a visual representation of the sprint's completed work compared to the total scope. And you can see the amount of work completed versus the amount of work remaining on a day-to-day basis. So you can track your team's progress toward the sprint completion and identify problems related to scope creep. And the only thing is that story points on any subtasks are not included in the Burnup chart. Only the story points on parent tasks are included. And so here's an example. The horizontal axis again represents time. The vertical axis represents the amount of work. And again, that would be, in this case, story points. The chart shows the red line, which is the scope line. And then the spikes in the work show that something has been added to this milestone. So the information, this is showing you that those changes, so that can be crucial at a retrospective to understand if, for example, there was too much work added, scope change, right? Or that the work was more complex than it was first estimated. So the estimates might have changed during the sprint. The green line completed means, that's the work completed, means completed stories or tasks. And the spikes in the green line mean that an issue has been completed, like the one shown on July 20th. And then finally, you've got the gray line. Again, it's the theoretical line showing the daily completion necessary to meet the deadline. And the distance between those two lines, is the amount of work remaining between the red and the green line. So when the sprint has been completed, hopefully those lines will meet. And so the chart contains a similar set of detail like you saw in the Burndown chart. The third report is an epic burndown. And recall that an epic is like a large user story that can be broken down into its individual smaller stories. And stories are hopefully completed in a single sprint, but the work for an epic, which contains all those stories, often spans many, many sprints. So you might want to track the epic burndown. And that means it shows you how the team is progressing against the work for a single epic that you choose in the report. So you'll see a list of all of the epics that are on the board. And again, you say, what do you mean on the board? Well, remember the board filter. shows you the issues it's going to show. And so the epics that it's going to show you as a drop down in the epic burndown will be the epics that are encompassed by the board filter. And so it will show you an epic, and then you can choose that epic to see how the team is progressing against a work for that epic. It is again based on the estimation statistic for that board. And you can see if any work was added during a sprint or removed during some sprint, and how that might possibly affect the team's overall progress. Again, this is for a single epic. So your burn down chart and burn up chart are for one single sprint. The epic burn down shows you how the work for an epic is progressing. So this report is similar to what we're going to see as the epic report, but it's optimized for Scrum teams because it makes tracking easier sprint to sprint. So here's an example. And again, remember that when we talk about like the numbers of things that are completed, we're referring to the estimation statistic, which in this case, this example is story points. So it's not the number of issues. When we say like 5 completed, we mean 5 story points as opposed to 5 issues. I mean, it may have been 5 issues if each of them were 1 story point. But again, remember that it's talking about the estimation statistic. So the name of the epic, I know it's a little hard to see, so just you get an idea where on the report. There's a lot of data here. This is the name of the epic, and you can see that it has 3 completed sprints represented by bars 2, 3, and 4, because the first bar is the total estimate, the original estimate of story points at the start of the epic. Then the light blue portion, the light blue portion of each work shows you the work remaining, which is 14 story points. It's a little hard to see here. And then each of the sprints, there's been work completed, and there's still work remaining. So what you see is the gray 3 bars on the right is that though it's estimating that 3 more sprints are going to be needed to complete the work for this epic. That's not a definite, that's just a prediction, because of course, it's possible that for the next 3 sprints, no work for this epic will be actually included in the sprint. And so at the bottom of the chart, there's also details of each of the completed issues. We're not showing you the detail here much, it's just the very bottom, but that's what you'll see. Okay. So, whoops, oh gosh, I wasn't advancing that again. I'm so sorry. Okay, let's take that back so you could see it better. 2, light blue, work remaining at the start of the sprint. Then the light green is work completed during the sprint that you could see here. Then here is the estimated number of sprints to finish the rest of the issues in the epic based on the completion rate of the first 3 sprints. So apologies for that. And then the table on the bottom. Okay. So let's go into the release burndown report. It's just like the epic burndown, but it shows you the information about the progress of releases or versions rather than epics. And in Jira software, there's no sort of release entity. It's a version that's an equivalent to the release. And it's often used instead of the release. The word release. So this report shows you how your team is progressing against the work for a release. It's based on, again, the estimation statistic. We keep saying that, right? And you can see how quickly your team is working through the backlog. You can see the work added and removed during the sprint and how that affects your progress, and helps you, again, predict how many sprints in the future it will take to complete the work for a version based on past sprints and changes during the sprints. So, it's also very similar to the version report, but we'll look at that in a bit. So if you missed all my arrows in the last report because I wasn't advancing them, here's your chance to look at that again here, because the release burndown is exactly the same as an epic burndown, except obviously it's looking at things committed to a version in Jira versus to an epic, but the idea is the same. Which means you first choose the version you're interested in. And again, those are versions for the project. And there's a viewing option where we selected, in this case, it's very small font, but TIS 1.8. There is the dark blue you could see in this report. We didn't see that with the Epic. That's shown below the bottom line, which means that was work added. There's actually a way to click this in Jira to say you want to see things below the baseline or not. In this case, you can clearly see there's a dip beneath the baseline, which means that's work added. That's easier and helpful to spot the scope changes. In number 5, you could see that's an active sprint, sprint 6. You could see the light green lines, and the light blue is the total work estimated at the start of the sprint. And the light blue and the dark blue is the total work in the version that's remaining at the end of the sprint. So hopefully you can see, using the legend in this, how much work is being completed, how much work is remaining, and whether work is being added to a version. So just looking at this at a glance, what you can see is there was a number 102 story points estimated for this version at the beginning for each sprint. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Some work was being done, some work is remaining, but there's also been scope changes, which means issues were added to that release. And so based on what you've been completing so far, it'll make an estimate of your average velocity for this release and tell you how many more sprints it might take to complete. So how it's making that prediction is, again, what is the velocity of completing work for this release or for this epic in the case of the epic Burndown. All right, sprint report. It contains a nice summary of the sprint. It shows you the number of issues completed or not completed. And it shows you scope changes, the issues that were added or removed from the sprint. It reflects your initial commitment. So all of the values of your stories are recorded when the sprint is started. So if you added a story point value of 5 before the sprint is started in a particular story, and then later you change it to 8, you'll see 5 in this report. It'll show you those original commitments. And then if you see no story points, it means that the team didn't estimate that issue. And 0 means that the team added a 0 point value. So you'll see all those changes of when it was actually added if you switch to the Burndown chart instead, because this just shows you those initial estimates. But it's very helpful for a mid-sprint progress check and sprint retrospectives, because it highlights the team's possible overcommitment or excessive scope creep. All right, the sprint, the top of the sprint report is the mini Burndown chart. Then it shows you completed issues, including those that have been added, issues not completed, and that's that. Yep, so quick report. The epic report is shows you a list of complete, incomplete, and unestimated issues in an epic. It's, again, useful for planning work for an epic that may extend across multiple sprints. And you can understand the progress that's made toward completing an epic over time and track the amount of remaining work that's either incomplete or unestimated. And so here is that chart. Here, what it's telling you is there's a total number of 17 story points in this particular chosen epic. Again, there's an epic dropdown. 8 story points are done. That corresponds to 4 issues on the right-hand side. So the story points are on the left, the number of issues are on the right. And you can see the completed issues in the section on the bottom. And so although all the issues were initially unestimated when they were added to the epic, because you could see that by the brown line, they've all been estimated now with 0 unestimated issues. Okay, so a quick look at version report. This shows you the team's progress toward completing a version and a predicted release date. It does not include subtasks, and it's only released versions, but not archived versions if you've archived them. The x-axis shows you the version start date. The it shows you the state of the version at any given point in time in terms of the total and completed story points. And again, you can see your scope changes. So let's take a look at this example. Again, a lot of fine print. So this is just sort of an overview. Here you see the today line. That's the vertical line today. You could see here is the predicted release date all the way at the end. So, and the release date was right next to today. So it's giving you an estimate of, wow, you're really behind in this release. The predicted release date is in the future, and it'll give you sort of a optimistic release date and pessimistic release date based on the predicted release date, 10%, plus or minus the average daily velocity that's predicted for this report. So it's sort of a big overview. All right, we're getting into the last velocity chart, the last report, the velocity chart. This one, hopefully everybody knows, shows you the value, the sum of your estimates delivered in each sprint. It shows you what's been committed versus what's actually been delivered, helps you predict in planning, and it generally, hopefully, improves over time as the team gets better at estimating. So here's a great velocity chart. You see the x-axis is the sprint, y-axis is the estimation statistic, and then each of the bars is each of your sprint commitments. The gray one is what the team committed, in this case 40 story points, and what they actually completed, which is 37 story points for the sprint one, and so on. And then you can see that both commitment and velocity are increasing, and in that final sprint 4, the team met their commitment in sprint 4. All right, I know we're getting towards the time of Q&A, so I'm going to just do a couple things on caveats, and then we'll get into Q&A shortly. One thing you may want to do is that the backlog view shows you when the time tracking is set to none. In the backlog view, you'll see the estimate in terms of story points. If you're using time tracking, your backlog view will show you your estimate in terms of time. So these are just nuances to note, that whether you're seeing the estimate in story points or an estimate with time as well, that depends, again, how your estimation time tracking statistic is set. The same is true here. You can see both those on the card. You can see the story points and the original estimate in that backlog issue detail view. In active sprints, you'll see the estimate on the card in terms of story points if, again, time tracking is set to none, or you'll see it in terms of remaining estimate and time spent if you're doing time tracking. On the burn down chart, when you burn down, if your estimation statistic is set to none, right, the time tracking, excuse me, is set to none, then you see the burn down in terms of story points. But if you've chosen time tracking set to remaining estimate and time spent, then your burn down can be seen in terms of the number of hours that have been estimated at the start of the sprint and logged during the sprint. So we're showing you all these caveats of how that difference in time tracking shows up on your reports. And then scope changes look like this during the Burndown chart. So you can see sort of the dips in here. You could see that we were doing great. Things were burning down with the red line, but then there was a scope change in that circled area when an issue was added to the sprint, right? And scope change of velocity chart, you see here, that's the difference, right? The commitment was the gray in sprint 3, but you delivered more, which is good in this case. So an issue was added with 13 story points and you were able to complete it. So that was the scope change here. And the estimation statistic shows up here on the right-hand side. And if you were doing story points, it shows you in terms of story points. If you're doing issue count, it shows you in terms of issue count. So these kind of caveats are great to know. All right, we have a lot of goodness in all of this for you, but it's time for Q&A. So I'm going to stop sharing the presentation. There's a lot for you all to digest, both in what I've presented, and if this is ringing a bell for you and looking like something you want to know more about. So again, you've hopefully seen the links to the full skill builder. With that, over to you, Ben.
Okay, great job, Joanna. That was a lot of information. We realize that may have gone fast for you, but we have been monitoring the Q&A up to this point. If you joined us late and you're not sure where to find that Q&A, I'm going to show you at the bottom of your Zoom screen. You should see that. I've circled it within the UI interface for Zoom for you to find. Click over there now, even if you don't have a question, because you can upvote or like questions that you'd like to see answered in the next few minutes by Joanna. You'll also note that there have been 54 questions already answered, and that's because we have some great teammates behind the scenes who are going to come to the front now. We're going to invite in both Marie and Emma, who have been feverishly typing answers to a lot of your questions, but have saved a few to answer here in live Q&A. So welcome in, Marie. Emma's coming to us from the Winter Olympics, I think, right? She hasn't come on screen yet, so you can't tell why that's funny. But when she does, you'll see that the three of them together are going to try to do their best and answer as many questions as they can. Now, before I let them start answering questions, I want to let you know, we're not going to get to every single one of your questions, and that's okay. We have a spot reserved for your questions and answers to them on Atlassian Community. Our other teammate, Jamie, is going to post a link to that community chat right now. So you can save that for later in case you don't get an answer to your question here today. You can ask it. And there's a whole global community of people, including our Atlassian team members, who could answer it. With that said, let's move into Q&A. I know Marie has got one queued up and ready to answer for you. Marie, take it away.
Thanks so much, Ben. So popular question that came up a few times was, why not give points to bugs? And there's nothing technically stopping you from adding points to bugs in your sprint. However, traditionally, this isn't done. The reason being is that points are a way to establish value. So it might not be the best decision to award the team points for fixing bugs that they probably created in a prior sprint. Another reason is that you're really measuring risk and by delivering a new change, and ideally that's tied to a story. But again, there's nothing technically stopping you from doing that. It's if you're having that conversation, I strongly suggest you get with your Scrum Master and get their take on it. Thank you.
Okay, so I think it's over to me to answer the next question. And well, there are many questions. And it's like the most number of questions I've been ever asked in a short space of time. But there was a specific one on enabling time tracking. And you, first of all, need to make sure you've got time tracking on in the admin panels. And of course, it's slightly different according to which version of Jira you're using, cloud or server. You also need to make sure that users in your project have the permission to do time tracking. So that's a project permission you need to check. So you might have to ask a project administrator or a Jira administrator to check that. And also you need to make sure that you've got the time tracking field on a screen. All of these things are Jira administrator questions. So that's my answer for today. Well, one of the answers. Over to Joanna.
Yes. Okay, I'm going to answer two people's questions in the same thing. One was if you enter a story point value, will it populate the estimate automatically, the original estimate? And no, those are separate fields. So again, story points is your estimation statistic, which you want to do to predict velocity. The original estimate is if you're going to be tracking time. Now, some people want to have the original time estimate as their estimation statistic. That's fine, but that field, original estimate, is always used for time. So if you want to use story points for estimation and you want to track time, then you need to enter both values before the sprint has started. You need to enter the story point estimate and you need to enter an original time estimate. And so during the sprint, as you're logging work against that original estimate, you'll see that time burning down. Over to you, Marie.
Thank you. Thank you, Joanna. So my next question that I'd like to answer is about how you can determine team capacity by using the Fibonacci sequence. And this makes an assumption that your capacity is based on risk and complexity. So ideally, those stories get estimated with what the team agrees collectively is the risk and the complexity. And then after 3 to 5 sprints, you can say, okay, our team can deliver this many points per sprint. So that capacity is all based on points. And over to you, Emma.
Thank you, Marie. A lot of people were asking about, well, there's a huge topic of story point estimation. And I was just going to share my experience of working in Scrum teams. And that's generally speaking, what happens is the stories get more refined, and it's usually the product owner working with the developers to refine those story points in the backlog. And then in the sprint planning session, you'll refine them even further. And at that point, this depends on the team that you're working with, but I've often worked with development teams where you take the story and at that point you'll divide it out into subtasks if you need to. And in some teams that I've worked with, they've used the subtasks as a place to add their estimates. I'm sorry, not their estimates, not time estimates. I mean, their work logs onto. So that's just my 2 cents on that. Joanna.
Yep. Answering a question that other folks added, but there's more to say about this from Nilesh about starting a sprint and finishing a sprint today. Kudos to you that you do your sprints in 1 day. But yes, the point is you can customize your start dates and end dates. So it'll default to like 2 weeks, but those are editable fields. So you can say, you're going to finish in a few hours. In fact, when I was creating some of these reports, I was using a very short time frame. So I would see the Burndown and Burnup after just, a few minutes or a few hours. And so, yes, you can, according to how you need, and you can actually even edit them during the sprint. The only thing I will caution you is, again, your velocity is assuming that you have consistent sprint durations. That's one caveat. The second one is that if you start your sprint before everything is estimated, then you won't have a guideline, right? Because it's using your estimation statistic at the start of the sprint. So if you estimated everything right now, and then you said that your sprint started yesterday, you'd have a flat guideline, for example. Marie?
All right, thanks, Joanna. So one that's come up is about the value of the reports if your data is constantly changing. There were a few different questions that asked that same question. And it's important to remember that one of the concepts of Agile is that you're always learning. And your data in Jira is going to reflect that day to day as your estimates change, as your backlog changes. So just remember when you look at those reports that it's showing what you know then. If you look at it the next day or the next week, it might show something different.
Okay, so there are lots of the questions. I'm just deciding on which one to answer. There are a couple of questions on relating to Scrum itself, and I would say definitely there's a couple of links that I put into Mountain Goat software, and there's lots of those questions specifically that you asked that are covered in blog posts and will be in much more detail and much more discussion than we can add here. So definitely go and take a look at that. And that is, there are lots and lots of other questions relating to things like why can't you use JQL queries to look at the numbers of story points that were taken out of one sprint and put into another, but you can use third-party apps to do that. And is there any features in Jira coming up? We can't talk to the roadmap, or I personally can't, but yeah, often to some of the questions that you've asked, there are third-party apps to do things like sum up story points to issues. So there are third-party apps around some of those things that are not available by default in Jira. I hope that's in some way helpful. Joanna.
Yep. Question about subtasks and how those play into estimation and the reporting. So if you're just using an estimation statistic for Burndown, you can create any number of subtasks before, after, or during a sprint, and they will not be reflected on your reports, because all you're really after is the original estimate on the story itself. So if you have a story that's worth 13 story points and it has 4 or 5 subtasks, you need to, during the sprint, add more subtasks, that's fine. 13 story points will burn down when the entire story is completed, which means when all of the subtasks are done. And remember that if, one of the subtasks is not done, but all the other ones are done, that story will get rolled back to the next sprint because all of them must be done. But anyway, you won't see them reflected on the reports if you're only using the estimation statistic. However, if you're using time tracking and subtasks, and you've estimated those subtasks, their time will also be showing you as burn down as a time statistic. So let's say you've said story, this story has an estimate of 1 day, but it has several subtasks and their estimates are 2 hours, 4 hours, and so on. If you estimate that and then you see on the chart and then they're done, that will get burned down as well. And creating new subtasks in that scenario that you're using time will actually show up as scope change.